Hi, everyone. I'm just going to I will just introduce myself whilst I'm seeing people joining. Thank you for joining me today. So I hope you're in the right place. We're going to be talking today about the signs and symptoms of somebody who might be struggling emotionally. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we recognize that, how we respond to that. And this could be about you, or it could be about somebody at work, a family member, a friend. We're focusing on adults here today. My name is Dr. Frogley. I'm a clinical psychologist at the LightHouse Arabia. I'm also the education lead, and I also work as part of the corporate services team. So I have a few different roles, but it means that today I'll be drawing upon my experience working with adults, with young people, but also within the workplace. So let's get into it. I know a few people are still joining, so there will be a recording of this that's sent out, but because we've got a lot to cover, I will get started. So in today's agenda, we're going to be speaking firstly about why mental health matters now. Why is this an important topic for us to be thinking about and talking about? I think with the pandemic, for example, there's a lot of us that perhaps are a little bit more aware of mental health, but even pre-pandemic, of course, there was more research, more data talking about mental health. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to really understand what we mean by mental health, because sometimes this is a bit of a dirty word, something that people don't believe that they have or don't really fully understand. So we're going to get really clear on what it means when we're talking about mental health. And then we're going to be focusing on depression and anxiety and knowing what is healthy sadness versus depression and what is healthy worry versus anxiety disorder. Because I think a lot of people sometimes are asking themselves, is this normal? Is this a sign of depression, or is this a sign of clinical anxiety? So we're just going to try and differentiate the difference between those two. And then in our final section, we will be talking about how can you respond to either yourself or to somebody who might be struggling with their mental health. And it could be mental health, it could maybe be a mental health disorder. So how you can respond sensitively, respectfully, and then also where can you get the right help? Where can you direct people if you think they need professional help? So we'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more, depending on how chatty I am today. But at the end, I will leave time for some questions. So please feel free to write any questions that you have along the way in the chat or the Q&A, and I will come back to them at the end and try and answer as many as I can. Okay. So let's think about mental health problems, and let's think about mental health and why this is an important topic. So we know that every single human being struggles at some point in their life. They may not necessarily go on to struggle with a mental health disorder, but it is part of the human condition to experience struggle. It's a really normal, to be expected part of life. So I think this is something that everyone should be taught in school, in their workplace, because we all have moments where things are tough, things are difficult. And if we can help people to be empowered, to understand that, to reduce the stigma around it, and to respond with empathy, with understanding, then we're going to live in a much more supportive community. So everyone struggles, but 1 in 4 people will struggle with a mental health disorder. And we're going to talk about what the difference is between those two things later. We know that mental health, it does not discriminate based on your IQ, your age, your gender, your race, your religion, where you are in the world. It is found everywhere, in every culture, at every age, in every gender. So it does not discriminate. It can affect any one of us at any time. Sadly, we know that every 40 seconds, somebody dies by suicide, which is an incredibly sad statistic. We know that depression is the second most common illness, including all physical and mental illnesses. So of every illness that you could possibly struggle with, Heart disease is number 1, but depression is number 2. And if we just think about how services are developed around physical versus mental health conditions, and how we respond to people who have depression versus how we might respond to somebody who has a diagnosis of cancer or heart disease, it's often very different. We don't have that equity in the way that we respond to these two very different but difficult experiences. We also know that depression is the leading cause of disability worldwide, and it's a major contributor to the overall global burden of disease. So the World Health Organization did a lot of research and continues to do a lot of research on the impact financially and as an economy on depression and other mental health difficulties. And because depression often means that people burn out in their work or they need to take time off sick, and if people are not getting the right treatment, that is likely to be prolonged over time. This is contributing to the overall global burden of disease. So from an employer perspective, it's a really important thing to support your work staff to ensure that they're getting the right support so they're less likely to take time off sick or to eventually have to leave employment completely, amongst other things. But that's one of the key findings that this study found, which is why in the UK, a lot of services were then set up to try and deal with mild to moderate levels of depression and anxiety, something called an IAPT service, which was aimed to prevent long-term disability through these conditions. Okay, so let's think a little bit more about mental health. So what do we mean by mental health? I want us to all be on the same page around this. It is often something that leaves a bad taste. It's a bit of a dirty word. People don't like talking about mental health, or they believe that mental health is for people who struggle, for people who have a disorder or an illness. And that is not true. We all have mental health. Every single human being on earth has mental health, just like we all have physical health. And there are some times in our life where our mental health is good. You know, we're thinking clearly, we're feeling mostly good in our state, we're able to kind of function in the way that we want to. That may be a time where our mental health is good. But we will all have moments where our mental health is poor. Maybe we're overthinking, maybe we're burdened by stress at work, maybe we've just had a new baby and we're experiencing a lot of emotional turmoil as a result of that. So there will be times in our life where we experience poor mental health. And this is all normal, to be expected, and part of the human condition. And just like with our physical health, there are things that we can do to prevent and promote good physical health. So we might eat well, we might go to the gym, we might make sure that we move our bodies, that we engage in things like yoga, we sleep well, all of these things that we do to ensure that our physical health is well. We brush our teeth, we wash our face, etc. There are these same things that we need to do for our mental health too, to protect our mental health, to prevent it, to look after it. So they are very much one and the same. They are very much interlinked. I can see people are raising your hand. Unfortunately, the way the webinar is set up, I can't come to you, but if there's a question, please write it in the chat and I will definitely come back to it at the end. So just to come back to this, we all have days of good mental health, poor mental health. We move up and down this spectrum all the time, okay? But of course, there are moments where perhaps that poor mental health persists over a period of time, and maybe we move into having what we would define as a mental health disorder or a mental health illness, which we're going to come on to. Okay, but as overall, we all have mental health. We all have good days and bad days. This is normal. This is to be expected. Okay. So just to summarize, mental health is something we all have and we all have to take care of. There are always things that we have to do to look after ourselves. It's important to our overall health. Again, in the UK, there's a phrase that is used on the back of one of a very important reports that was created around mental health and physical health. And the phrase is, there's no health without mental health. And I think that really rings true. We no longer can separate our physical and our mental well-being. If our physical well-being is not well, our mind will feel it. And if our mental well-being is not well, then our body is going to feel it too. There is a pathway that runs between the brain and every vital organ in the body. It's called the vagus nerve, and it's constantly communicating backwards and forwards. So there is no separation. They work together. There is no health without mental health. When we're talking about mental health, what we're talking about is the health of our mind, our thoughts, our feelings, our behaviors. Okay, it's on a continuum, it's flexible, and it's changing. You don't always feel good all of the time. You don't always feel happy all of the time. And unfortunately, sometimes there is this suggestion and this message that's given to us in our childhoods, in social media, in what we see and what we read, that we should feel happy all the time. And actually, that's not true. You know, we should feel sad, we should feel jealous, we should feel angry, we should feel guilty. All of these emotions are normal and part of being a human being. Mental health is not something that only people who are crazy or weak or who have a mental illness have. It is not. We all have mental health. It is not the same as having a mental illness, and we're going to look at what that means in a moment. It's not about feeling good all the time, as I just said, and it's not a fixed state. It moves up and down that spectrum all of the time. Okay. So what does it mean to have a mental health problem? What is the difference between a normal couple of days of feeling sad and clinical depression? So we're going to talk a little bit more about this. So I think we often feel that, well, we often expect that mental illness is going to be obvious, that people are going to see or be able to know that their friend or their family member or they themselves are struggling with a mental illness. But often mental illness is invisible and it's hard to spot, and it's not always clear who are the people in your life that are struggling. So these two images, one is Van Gogh, who struggled with mental health difficulties himself, who painted this picture of himself in a depressed state. And this is Eeyore. So if you watch Winnie the Pooh, who is one of my favorite childhood movies, Eeyore walks around with this dark cloud and he's mopey and he's quite clearly quite pessimistic, but that's typically not necessarily what mental illness looks like. Mental illness can look like this. Okay, so there we go. So, sorry, my computer's decided to be a little bit slow. So on that last page, it'll take a moment to come back to us, but on that last page, we have images of Princess Diana, we have Dwayne Johnson, we have Elon Musk, we have Martin Luther King. So these are people that we associate with a great deal of success, maybe money. You know, they seem to have so many things going well in their life, and yet they have all spoken publicly about struggling. And yet we probably wouldn't know that unless they had spoken about it. And to the outside world, they may look like somebody who has it all together, who makes jokes, who is happy, etc. And I think we can all think of people in the public eye who have expressed and talked about being mentally unwell, and yet who appear to be very successful people. So there we go. So it can be very hard to spot. And I think one of the most painful things for people is when a loved one that they didn't realize was struggling, it comes to light that they are really struggling. And that can feel quite difficult because, of course, we want to help people and we feel guilty if we've missed it. So it's not obvious, it's invisible often. So we have to be setting up an environment where people can speak to us, and we have to inform ourselves and educate ourselves around what are the signs and symptoms to look out for. So when we're thinking about a mental illness versus a normal, healthy period of sadness or anxiety, we're looking for major changes to thoughts, feelings, and behavior. We're looking for the mental illness to be persistent over time. So typically, most of the diagnoses will ask for persistent symptoms for 2 weeks or more. It has to impair functioning. So it has to impact that person's ability to do the things that they would normally do, whether that's being a father, whether that's going into work, whether that's, getting up and just getting dressed in the morning, for example. So it has to have some impairment in that person's life and functioning. Okay. I've already spoken about physical health and how interlinked they are, but we also know that often people might present with physical health problems before a mental health problem. So things like stomach pain, headaches, tension in muscles, neck pain, joint pain. There are lots and lots of ways in which the body expresses its stress or its mental disruption. So it has a huge impact on physical health. We also know that when people have struggled with a physical health condition, if they also struggle with depression, it can have a bigger impact on that person physically. So in extreme cases, it can shorten a person's life, and it can also worsen the impact of pain associated with physical illness. And there's loads and loads more research coming out about this. It's really important that we detect and we intervene early, and the earlier we can impact somebody, the better their outcomes are. The shorter the treatment that's required, the less intense that treatment is, and they're much more likely to have a fuller and longer lasting recovery and an increased self-esteem and motivation. I work a lot with young people. I really enjoy working with teenagers. And one of the things I think is really important about that work is that we know that most people first experience mental health difficulties in their teenage years, not necessarily, but often half of all mental health difficulties start by the age of 14. So I really enjoy and I really advocate and I promote that we support people early in their life to prevent more serious mental health difficulties coming later on in life. And we know that 2 of 3 people never seek treatment or help for their mental health difficulties. So when we're recognizing the signs, we're thinking about risk factors. So as psychologists, we operate on a biopsychosocial model. And what that means is there are kind of 3 key elements that impact a person's likelihood to develop a mental health difficulty. So there are biological elements, there are psychological elements, and there are social elements. Okay. And what that means is if we think about biology, what we're thinking about is their genetic disposition. So we know that there is a small but genetic link to things like depression and anxiety and mental health in general. Some difficulties, some mental health disorders, for example, autism, ADHD, for example, bipolar, they have a stronger genetic link. So there's more of a genetic vulnerability in those disorders. But we also see it with things like depression and anxiety. Now, that doesn't mean that if you have a family history of mental illness that you're destined to have a mental health problem. That is not true at all. And there are certainly things you can do to mitigate and reduce the likelihood of you developing a mental health condition. But it does mean that potentially, not always, but potentially there is a vulnerability. And what we know about genes is that there are certain things that turn genes on or off. And things like traumatic life events can be one of the triggers that turns one of those genes on. I hope that's making sense. So it's unlikely that we just see one thing. Normally we see some biological elements, we see some psychological elements, and we see social elements as well. So when we're thinking about psychological elements, we're talking about traumatic life events, we're talking about patterns of thinking, we're talking about personality types, talking about attachments and people that you have had growing up, how they've communicated with you, responded to you, what they've taught you about what it means to be a human. All of those kind of psychological aspects can have an impact on whether or not you develop a mental health difficulty. In addition, the social setting in which you grow up and in which you find yourself in now also has an impact. We know that one of the biggest mitigators of mental distress is having a good, strong, meaningful social support system. So if you have people in your life that you can share things with, that you feel connected to, even if you go through really, really traumatic things, having that can reduce your likelihood of going on to develop mental health difficulties. Not always, and I do see people who do have very strong connections who still struggle, but it's one of those things that we know can really help people to manage difficult things that happen to them. We also know that society and stigma has a big impact. So whether or not you're living in a society that allows you to speak about your experiences or not, that also has a huge impact on you. And any kind of further events that may happen to you will also impact whether or not you are likely to develop a mental health difficulty. Okay. So let's take a closer look at depression and anxiety. I know I've whizzed through that last section. If there are things that you want to know about risk factors, I'm very happy to come back to it. It's a big topic, but yeah, please do let me know if there are questions about that I haven't been clear on. So when we think about clinical depression, what is the difference between these two things? So as I said before, it's really normal to experience sadness. I know feeling sad is not what we like to experience. I don't like feeling sad. I'm sure you don't like feeling sad or low or demotivated or a bit disconnected. But these things, if they don't meet this criteria, they're actually very, very normal ways of experiencing life, particularly if there's something that's happened in your life recently that warrants that sadness. So when we lose someone, for example, we're going to feel sad for a period of time, and that is really healthy and really normal. Or if we've just had a recent transition, for example, if we've become a parent or we've moved countries or we've gone through a divorce or something like this, we're going to experience sadness. That is a really healthy, normal way to process and approach that kind of situation. Now, depression is when that depressed mood does not go away, at least for 2 weeks consistently every single day, and when it's having a significant impact on that person's functioning. Now, if there's been a recent bereavement, it's not going to go away within 2 weeks. That is going to last a lot longer. Or if somebody has been through a traumatic incident, again, that impact is going to last a lot longer. So in those cases, people may or may not be diagnosed with depression. But if those things aren't there and you have been feeling low or disconnected and numb for 2 weeks or more, and it's having a significant impact on your functioning, you may be experiencing clinical depression. And what that means is you'll experience a loss of interest or pleasure in activities. You may be tearful most of the day or every day. Or actually, I hear a lot of people saying, rather than feeling sad, they just feel nothing. They feel numb. They have a lack of energy. They feel very tired. They may sleep more or sleep less. They may have difficulty concentrating or making decisions. They may feel quite lethargic and unable to feel energy or energized and become quite agitated. I think you see a lot of aggression or irritability and anger in depression, particularly with men, but not always. I definitely have seen this with women too. I've already mentioned changes in sleep, either sleeping more or sleeping less than normal. Changes in appetite, so again, eating more or eating less. Eating can sometimes be something that we use to regulate ourselves. So we can either eat more to kind of soothe how we're feeling, or for some people, not eating very much actually numbs them to certain feelings. Irritability, I've already mentioned, feeling worthless, feeling guilty when things are not really that person's fault, and perhaps thinking about death or maybe even wishing that they were dead. Okay, so these are some of the things to look out for with depression. My computer is now being slow again. I apologize. I think it's the end of the year. It doesn't want to do it anymore. Sorry, I'm just going to wait. I'm just trying to guess what the next slide is off the top of my head. I can't remember if we go straight into anxiety or whether there's something more about depression. Can't remember without looking at it. With depression, as I said, these are some of the things that you may want to look out for. And when we move into anxiety, again, what we're looking out for is major changes to thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Okay, so it is very normal to experience anxiety at certain points in our life. It's very common and normal to experience stress at work as well, as a result of what is happening at that particular time, or stress in our lives due to other things. And it is only clinically diagnosable as a condition when that stress is persistent over time, when it perhaps doesn't always correlate to something, a specific situation that's happening in that person's life. Sometimes people who experience anxiety say they just wake up and feel anxious, even though there's no real kind of trigger to that anxiety. Their feelings of anxiety may be very, very intense. In some cases, it can cause panic attacks. But for others, it will just feel like those physical symptoms of anxiety are just very intense, very strong, and they're persistent over time. And our bodies are designed to trigger that fight or flight response, create anxiety, create that anxiety response for a period of time, and then come back down to baseline. But when somebody is in that high cortisol, high adrenaline state over a period of time, we know that A, feels awful, and B, really creates difficulties and can lead to physical health problems later down the line too. And in cases where that chronic stress is present over a period of time, can also lead to burnout, because bodies are not designed to consistently be throwing cortisol and adrenaline out to keep you on high alert all of the time. And eventually it leads to a burnout where your body says, we can't do this anymore. Okay, so, I've already talked about sadness versus depression. So let's move into anxiety. Apologies, guys, my computer's deciding when it wants to work and when it doesn't. So I think I've gone through those things. I know that the next slide after talking about anxiety speaks about what the overlap is. So you will hear that there is a lot of overlap with anxiety and depression, and sometimes it's very hard to tease those things out. So things like lack of concentration, sleeping more, sleeping less, lack of focus, for example, and in some cases experiencing suicidal thoughts are also things that you can see coming across both those difficulties. So if you're not sure about yourself or somebody else, the best thing I can suggest that you do is see a GP or a mental health professional who can help you understand some of those things and whether this is anxiety or depression. So as I said, anxiety disorders are an umbrella of many different disorders. So it could be post-traumatic stress disorder, OCD, generalized anxiety disorder. There's many different types of anxiety disorders, but essentially we're working on different fears, different worries, and how a person responds and processes those things. As I said, it's often felt very much physically in the body. It can be very vague, very unsettling, and it can seriously affect day-to-day living. And one of the key things that we see with anxiety disorders is that people will avoid things that make them feel anxious. And that often keeps the anxiety going because they're not learning that I can cope with my fears, and or that the thing that they're afraid of perhaps isn't as dangerous as it feels in that moment. So we tend to see people either avoiding things that make them anxious, or they might try and put things in place to help them feel in control of that anxiety. So that can be compulsions, or it can be kind of controlling behavior, or sometimes we name them as safety behaviors, which often can actually continue to keep that anxiety going. Because again, people become dependent on those strategies to cope, when in actual fact, they could learn slowly and gradually that they can cope without those things. Sorry, my My slides are being incredibly slow, so I apologize. I'm going to give them just a moment. Maybe I'll come and have a look at the chat whilst I'm waiting for it. Computer having depression. Thank you. Yes, I think my computer is feeling not very well today, unfortunately. So let me come out and go back in again. Apologies. Sometimes this has happened once before, and I think my laptop just needs to be replaced, unfortunately. I don't think it likes all these lovely presentations anymore. It really has frozen on me now. Sorry, everyone. I know this is really frustrating. I'm trying to stop sharing my screen, but even that I'm struggling with. Oh. Hello, I don't know if you guys are there. I don't know if you guys are there. I've lost you. I think my computer really has gone a bit funny. I'm struggling to do anything. What do I need to do? Okay, are we here? We're still here. Sorry, guys. You're still there. Okay, thank you. Sorry, I lost you for a moment. Let me try and go back into it. Do you know what? I might do it like this because I think this is safer. Sorry about that. I don't know what's happening. So where was I? So I've spoken about the common signs and symptoms of anxiety. So pounding heart, chest pain, blushing, dizziness, sweating, numbness, all of these can be physical signs of anxiety. And you may have heard this being referred to as the fight or flight response, which is integral to our survival as human beings, and something that we really need to have to be able to survive. But at the same time, it doesn't feel very nice. Okay, psychologically, we can have lots of thoughts. So when we're in that fight or flight, our brain is designed to be very focused, very narrow in its thinking. So this is why it's very hard to think about other things when you're anxious, because your brain is naturally designed to get you to focus on what is causing that anxiety, because that's the way that you're going to make amends, you're going to problem solve and solve a solution. There again, that's going to affect your concentration. It's going to make you feel quite indecisive, maybe, or impatient or angry, and that feeling on edge. And behaviorally, I've already spoken about avoidance or obsessive compulsive disorder. So I spoke a little bit earlier about stress versus burnout. So when stress is a very common thing that we as humans encounter. And some stress is actually helpful and motivating and optimal, because a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of stress helps us to attend to what needs to be attended to. So if I'm worried about doing well in this presentation, for example, I'm going to prepare beforehand and I'm going to think about what I'm going to say beforehand. Whereas maybe if I didn't experience that, maybe I wouldn't prepare in the same way, for example. But when that stress is more intense or it's prolonged, that's when we potentially are going to move into chronic stress, which is not healthy, and or sometimes burnout. So stress is kind of an over-engagement. It's reactive, or it's overreactive emotions to a situation. There's a sense of urgency or hyperactivity, you need to get things done now. Or you can feel quite disconnected. It can be either. It can be a restlessness or a loss of energy. It can, over time, lead to an anxiety disorder. It's physically tolling. As I said, our bodies are not designed to continuously pump out lots of cortisol and adrenaline over a long period of time. And to be extreme but very blunt about it, it can kill you prematurely. Unmanaged chronic stress can have a huge impact on the heart and on every part of your body, in fact. Now, burnout is when you're trying to put the pedal on the gas and get going in the morning and you just can't. It's your body literally saying, we cannot be giving that cortisol and adrenaline anymore. So it's when you actually become very disengaged, you feel very blunted, or you're unable to feel your emotions. There's a sense of helplessness, there's a loss of motivation or hope, and it can lead to detachment and depression. And again, it's very emotionally tolling, and can make life seem like not worth living, actually. Okay, so I hope that makes the difference. So let's just think a little bit now about safeguarding mental health, what you can do for yourself and what you can do for others. And then we're going to talk about how you can respond to people who you feel might be struggling, either with a disorder or just in general. So emotionally, what is our emotional hygiene? A little bit like how we attend to our physical health. There are certain things we can do to protect and prevent us from developing a mental health condition. So first of all, the very basics are really important. So the things that we do for our physical health are also very important for our mental health. So sleep is the single most effective thing you can do for your mind and your body. And in society today, we are in a chronic epidemic of sleep deprivation. People in general are not getting enough sleep. And certainly my work in this region with young people and with adults often starts with sleep, because so many people are getting less than 7 hours of sleep, which is the absolute minimum you should be getting every night. And you should be giving yourself an 8-hour window to get those 7 hours of sleep. And most people that I encounter are not doing that. And it's really, really important that we prioritize sleep in a society where we've got phones, we've got artificial lights, we've got all these things that can distract us. Sleep is so important. And we have a whole webinar on sleep. So if you're interested, I would highly recommend you come and see us talk about sleep, because it's a fascinating and very important topic. We know exercise is also really important for our mental health. It really has so many benefits. And actually, there's lots of research now saying that some of the benefits of exercise are as good as some antidepressants, which is incredible. So exercise, moving your body, it doesn't mean that you have to, sign up for 5 exercise classes a week, but moving your body, going for a walk, doing yoga, it can be gentle movement, whatever you feel comfortable with. It's really important for our mental health. Our fluid intake is also really important. If you think about your brain, it's an organ, it needs water, it needs nutrition. So we need to feed it the right things. And again, there's a really fascinating book. Now I've forgotten the name of it. Damn it, I've forgotten, sorry. It's a really good book about feeding the brain, food in the brain, something like that. It's really cool. And it talks about how nutrition is so vital for our brain development. If I remember it by the end, I will definitely share it with you. Pay attention to emotional pain or triggers. So this is our soft skills, our emotional intelligence that is so underplayed and yet is more important for success than IQ. And there is loads of research now that says this is absolutely true. And if you think about your experience at school and at work, most people's problems around those things stem from relationships and how to deal with people and how to communicate feelings, etc. So pay attention to emotional pain and triggers. Get good at understanding yourself. Get curious about how you feel in certain situations, about how you think about certain situations. I think one of the easiest and best ways you can do this is to journal, is to write down things, to try and kind of organize your thoughts and feelings, and just get more conscious about these things. It's so vital, such an important skill that we have and can be really protective of our mental health. In addition to those things, finding ways to feel your feelings is really important. There's a really fantastic book on this called Permission to Feel by Dr. Mark Brackett, and I encourage you to read it. It's really interesting when you think about the fact that we're not taught how to feel in many of our families. And yet, so what we do is we push and we avoid feeling difficult things. And actually, if we're able to learn the tools to feel the full breadth of emotions and know how to deal with them, we're going to feel more in control, and we're going to feel better able to cope with difficulties when they arise. You also want to think about how you focus on what is in and what is out of your control. That can be really important. We want to limit things that we know affect us. So caffeine triggers a similar physiological response in us as anxiety. So we don't want to drink too much caffeine. And if we're struggling with anxiety, that's a really good thing to remove from your diet if you can, or limit. And limit triggers. So I'm saying the news here, but it could be other things. You know, if you know that being with your mother causes you a lot of anxiety, then, you know, thinking consciously about how you put boundaries into that communication. I mean, I'm not saying you don't see your mother at all, but you think about the times and the ways in which you spend time with those people that might trigger you and might make you feel a certain way. Asking for help is a huge part of emotional intelligence. It's underrated because we're taught in society often to be very independent, but we all need help. We are social beings, we live in communities, we should and need to rely on people sometimes. Mindfulness is a really great skill that I think we could all benefit from, that helps us to be more present in our life, where there are many things that take us away from being present. And it has many, many benefits in terms of our mental health. And in some cases, counseling or working with a mental health professional or a life coach may also be important. And it doesn't necessarily have to be only when you're struggling. Often working with a life coach or a psychologist or a therapist can help prevent things and just help you deepen your knowledge of yourself. And that, I think, obviously I'm a huge advocate for therapy, but I think it can be life-changing in some cases. So in our last section, and I'll try and speed up because I can see there are some questions and I want to make sure I come to them, just thinking about how you can respond. Okay, so we're going to talk about the 3 C's, which is checking in, connecting with empathy, and clarifying information. Okay, so checking in means, first of all, checking in with yourself. So it's true what they say, you cannot pour from an empty cup. You should put your oxygen mask on first before you help children or other people around you. It's cheesy, but it's true. You have to have the emotional tolerance and the emotional skills to be able to look after yourself first before you then go and support somebody else. So checking in with yourself is crucial, and choosing a time and a place where you're in a position to give that person time, space, energy to talk about whatever it is that might be going on. You want to think about your data points. What I mean by this is if there are things that you've noticed about this person and it's making you question whether there's something that they're struggling with, you want to just think in your mind and get some data points ready. So you want to think, I've noticed that this person, they haven't responded to my messages for some time. They seem to be withdrawing from our social events. Maybe they're sending emails at strange hours in the morning. So just think about, what are the data points? What are the things that I'm noticing that makes me worried about this person? And be ready to name them sensitively with that person, not in an accusatory way, but in a, I've noticed that X, Y, Z, and I'm worried about you, and I just wondered if everything is okay. We then want to connect with empathy. I really believe that empathy is the golden ticket in life. And I think, again, I would love for empathy to be taught more in schools. I think it is actually, but more and more, because the better we can empathize with others, the much better able we are to really support people. So what we mean by empathy is the ability to be able to put yourself in the shoes of somebody else and appreciate that even if you don't feel the way they feel, or you see things very differently, you accept and acknowledge that their perspective or their feelings about something is what it is. And it's connecting one-to-one. It's being curious about their experience, not jumping to problem solving, not jumping with judgments or help, but really just taking a step back to listen and ask open-ended questions, to try to understand how they see the issue. And that's not always easy. You know, sometimes people can see things that to you is really irrational, or it doesn't make sense. You know, someone might say, you know, they feel like they're worthless, and you can see all the ways in which they're worthy. But you want to, rather than kind of jumping in, well, this is why you're worthy, this is what other people see, which might come later, you first of all want to just say, wow, if that's how you feel, I can really understand why you're feeling so rubbish at the moment. And yet I don't see you that way. You know, I don't see you as being worthless. So just some ideas about how we can do that. So having empathy would sound like, what's this been like for you? Lately, I've noticed this. I'm worried about you. How are things? Tell me more about what that's been like for you. How long have you been feeling this way? Have you ever experienced something like this before? What do you think would help right now? What can I do to help? So you see how they're really open. They're not shutting down. They're not making any kind of assumptions or judgments about the person. They're really open. If we're going in a place of sympathy or judgment, it's going to sound more like, I feel so bad for you. That's too bad. Come on, it's not that big of a deal. At least all these other things are going well for you. You just need to be positive. You just need to be thankful or grateful for what you have. It's all in your head. Okay. And these are things that people do say, you know, and they say them with the best intentions. They want to help. They want to help that person feel better. But actually, that can feel very dismissing for the person who is finding it's very difficult for them to be positive in that moment. Okay. And then the last thing you want to do is just clarify information, and you want to point them in the direction of good professional help if they need it, or help, you know, good resources that they can access online or whatever it is. So you might want to share with them, you know, some of the things that you've learned today. So the fact that, you know, 1 in 4 people struggle with a mental health difficulty, or you know that it's actually really common to struggle with a mental health difficulty, and that you know that there is professional support that is effective at treating these things. So just kind of reducing stigma, letting them know some of the information you've learned today can be really helpful. Just so you know, there are many professionals who can help somebody. So if you're not sure, or if somebody in your life is struggling and you want them to get an opinion from somebody who is trained to assess for a mental health condition, then the first port of call often can be a GP. They are trained in physical and mental health, so they will be able to assess initially and refer on to a mental health professional if they think it's necessary. And this sometimes is a little bit easier for people to do, rather than going straight to a psychologist or a psychiatrist. A psychologist is somebody like me who is trained in mental health and who delivers talk therapy. So I don't deal with anything to do with medication. I only deliver therapy. Whereas a psychiatrist will manage medication, will review people and see if medication is something that they need to also support them with their mental health. Okay, there are others, but these are kind of the key 3 players. You may or may not have people in your life or in your workplace who are mental health first aiders. This is a in-depth 2-day training that you can do with us at the Lighthouse. You can sign up as an individual, or in your workplace, you can sign up as a workplace. This is more in-depth information about how to respond to people with a mental health difficulty. If you're at work, you may have a human resources service. You might seek support from religious or faith leaders. Embassies can sometimes be helpful, non-profit organizations, and some employee assistance programs also offer free or low-cost counselling services as well. So there are many avenues, there are many professionals who can support you or a colleague who may be struggling with their mental health. And I'm just going to end on something that President Obama, or previously President Obama, shared. If something inside you feels it's wounded, it's just like a physical injury. You've got to go get help. There's nothing weak about that. It's strong. And I think that is a lovely way to just end this webinar today. Okay. Thank you all for sticking with me when I was having technical difficulties. I really appreciate it. And let me see what questions we have. I can see you were all responding to me when I was panicking earlier about my computer not working. Thank you so much. I'm sorry that there was a bit of a disruption there. Okay, please continue. You're doing fine. Thank you so much. The book, so How to Feed a Brain. Yes, I think that might be it actually. Yes. So How to Feed a Brain, Nutrition for Optimal Brain Function. Yeah, this is the one I was talking about. Let me, I'll put it on. Oh, it's on the chat, isn't it? So you can see that. Wonderful. Yeah, it's a really great book, a really good book. And the other book I mentioned, I'll write it in the chat now, was Permission to Feel by Dr. Mark Brackett. I think is a good book for anyone who's interested in how to approach their emotions in general. And he actually takes you through step by step how you can better do that. So it's quite practical, but it's also got lots of theory and research in there as well. Another great book that I like, if you're interested in learning a bit more about depression, is Lost Connections by Johan Hari. I'm not sure if I spelled his name right there. It's Johan Hari, maybe it's Johan, something like that. Actually, yeah, I think this is how you spell it. That's a really, really fantastic book. And again, not necessarily if you're struggling with depression, but just thinking about why people struggle with depression more in society at the moment. So I think that's a really important book as well. You guys are so lovely. I've got really nice comments saying that I manage well. Thank you. The sleeping webinar, I would really recommend. Please do come along to that. I thought I saw a question earlier. No, I think you're just all being very encouraging. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Let me see if there's any on the chat. Okay, so somebody has asked, do you feel depressed due to any vitamin deficiency, e.g. vitamin D or vitamin B12? Absolutely, definitely. So if you go back to the risk factors that I spoke about, so we spoke about the biopsychosocial model and the biological aspect. I spoke a lot about genes, but there are also physical conditions that can impact your mood. And one of them is your nutrition, absolutely. I used to work in a feeding and eating disorder service in the UK, and I would often see issues with mood, with being quite rigid and unable to kind of think flexibly about situations, being quite irritable and low when people weren't adequately nutritionally efficient. So either they weren't getting enough of their vitamins and minerals that they needed, or they just weren't eating enough food in general, so their calorie intake was too low. So that can have a huge impact on you. And actually recently I've been working with somebody, an adult, and one of the first things I said was, let's just get you looked at by the GP. Let's just check everything else is going okay, because she was quite depressed. And we also found that she had vitamin D and vitamin B12 deficiency, and just supplementing that made a huge difference to her mood. So absolutely, nutrition is vital for our well-being, our mental well-being. And so if you're concerned, I would definitely get that checked by the GP as well. Okay. Yes, so somebody has also asked, will the slides and the webinar recording be shared? Yes, if you can bear to watch me struggle with my slides again, this is being recorded and it will be shared with you at a later date. So I think later this afternoon you should receive it, if not early tomorrow. So you will receive the recording then. please just bear with me when you watch that bit of me struggling again. What's the first aid that can be given for somebody dealing with anxiety? So if you're interested in really deep diving in what you can do and how you can become a mental health first aider, I would strongly encourage for you to join one of our public trainings in mental health first aid. So you can find all the information on that on our website, which is www.lighthousearabia.com, or on our Instagram page, which is at Lighthouse Arabia. We run them every month. I think probably in December. I don't think we're running any more now, but we will be back up and running in January. So if you really want to understand how can I be a mental health first aider, it's a qualification, it's internationally recognized, it's something that's developed and trained in the UK, in the US, in Australia, all around the world. So if you wanted to join that training, I would encourage you to do that. But in general, I would ask you to think about those 3 C's. So if somebody is struggling with anxiety, you want to check in with yourself, gather your data points, you want to connect with empathy, and you want to clarify information and give them advice about where they can go to seek support. So it's those 3 C's that we spoke about earlier. Okay, so I'm going to put Lighthouse Arabia here so you can have a look. Our events, I think if I do /events, that should take you there. We also have an Instagram, we have many Instagram pages, but this one will give you all the details about our services for adults. If you have a child, we also have LightHouse which is for young people, so the service that I manage as well. Okay. Thank you. I'm getting lots of thank you. So thank you so much. I'm just going to check if I've got any other questions. No. All right. Well, I will stop there for today. Thank you again for bearing with me. I can see most of you did stay right till the end, so thank you. And I will look forward to hearing from you soon. Yeah, someone has just asked, what about teenagers or preteens? We also have a mental health first aid training for adolescents, which is specifically around how to support adolescents, because there are differences in the way that their mental health difficulties present, and they are a very vulnerable group because of the changes that are happening in their brain. So again, there are lots more information about that in some of our other webinars, and also in the MHFA for adolescent training that we run, again, on a monthly basis. So please do check that out. And the LightHouse.Psy Instagram account is all for teenagers. So that may also be a useful thing if you're a parent, or if you have a young person, you might want to check that out as well with all the latest information. Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure to be here today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your week. Thank you.